Thank you very much. My name is Raul Grijalva, co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. My colleagues are leaving some of their hearings or starting some of their hearings, and they'll be joining us as we go along. We wanted to start on time and have the testimony today in the record and begin this hearing. It's an ad hoc hearing to talk about specifically the impact of current immigration policies on children, family unification, and women. As has been stated before, there's been a consistent failure on the part of current immigration policies to consider children's needs, their rights, to consider and protect children and women, and to promote the underlying concept of immigration reform that many of us adhere to, which is family unity and a sustainable life for families in this country. The lack of a policy to deal with those consequences is causing the devastating crisis that we have across this nation. Today we're going to hear from persons directly affected by these policies, the first panel, and then we're also going to hear from advocates and experts to also deal with their testimony about the overwhelming crisis that we're facing and providing us with some recommendations. The frustration around this is that there's been a very cynical, in my mind, and a very contrived refusal by the Republican leadership of the House of Representatives to address this crisis, to address immigration reform in general, and to address the humanitarian cost of lack of action. And by not doing anything, we only continue to add to the toll that we see across this nation. Good example, even a low-hanging fruit like the Enlist Act, sponsored by a Republican, is not allowed to proceed by leadership. And while, Washington and all the machinations and theories about what's going to happen in elections play this chess game, that human toll continues. And, ironically today, and good, is that we have the Mass being conducted by the bishops and their request and pleading for Congress to act on immigration reform and to act on this crisis. We also, at 10 o'clock, the Homeland Security and Oversight Committee, the full committee, will be having a hearing with Secretary Johnson and to talk about immigration reform. I suspect a lot of it will be saber rattling about enforcement. What do we need to do more? Zero tolerance, on and on and on. Hopefully, our side of the aisle raises the humanitarian issues and the crisis that are facing us. We felt this hearing was important to give a human face and a human understanding that Congress doesn't receive to the issue that many of us have to deal with every day in our respective districts across this nation, not just isolated in any one part. And so today, that's the point of the hearing, to allow Congress and to enter into the full record of the House of Representatives this hearing so that we become part of the testimony and part of the discussion as we go forward. There's been some sort of understanding that July 4th is becoming the next magic date in which the Republican leadership in the House has an opportunity to move immigration reform forward to deal with this crisis. If family unity and the crisis that we're going to hear about today is not part and parcel of that discussion after July 4th, then I think we've missed the point. And so we wait one more time. I, for one, think that we need to continue to push. I, for one, think that we continue to insist and advocate and demand that through whatever option, executive or legislative, that the needs of the families and the individuals that we're going to talk about today, the kids and the women in this primary focus, has to be given a priority by whatever avenue is available. With that, let me thank the first panel for being here and turn to my colleague and good friend from Minnesota, someone who has been a champion on this issue and an outspoken advocate for something just and rational regarding immigration reform. Mr. Pocan, for any brief opening statements that you might have, sir. And thank you for being here.
Sure. Thank you, Representative Grijalva, and thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm just glad to be here and to listen again, as Representative Grijalva said, to the personal stories. A lot of what we talk about in Washington is at a different level. It's not at a level of how the rubber hits the road and how people are really affected by not having the reform that we so desperately need. So I hear about it in my district in South Central Wisconsin on a regular basis, and I'm just really glad to be here. I look forward to hearing the testimony. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, sir. Let me begin with the first panel and thank them very, very much for taking the time to be with us today. And I'll begin with Andrea Casola, ¿verdad? Okay, Andrea Casola. And Ms. Casola is an immigrant from Michoacan, Mexico, lives in Washington State. She's a mom of two and a community leader who is active with One America, LULAC, and her local YWCA. She's a liaison between the Latino community and the Vancouver, Washington Police Force. She's a survivor of domestic violence, and her story illustrates the urgency of passing fair immigration reform that's going to include protections against abuse and will allow all immigrant women to contribute to their respective communities without fear and without the sense that they need to not come forward and deal with some of the issues that they confront. With that, Maria, muchas gracias, and turn it over to you. Pueden comenzar cuando.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Adriana Cazorla. Gracias por la invitación de hablar aquí con ustedes. Les voy a contar mi historia. Yo soy sobreviviente de violencia doméstica. Mi esposo usó mi estatus migratorio para amenaza por muchos años.
Good morning. My name is Adriana Cazorla. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. This is my story, but I know that it is also the story of numerous other immigrant women. I'm a survivor of domestic violence, and my husband used my immigration status to threaten me for over 12 years.
Yo vine aquí a Estados Unidos desde el 95. Mi esposo me dijo que tenía que venir con él. Si no venía, él me iba a quitar a mi hijo de 2 años y que nunca lo volvería a ver. El papá de él fue quien le arregló papeles y es por eso que yo tuve que cruzar la frontera sin documentos.
I came to this country from Mexico in 1995 because my husband told me that I had to come with him. If I refused, he said he would take our 2-year-old son with him and that I would never see him again. My husband's father had arranged for him to immigrate legally, but I had no choice but to cross illegally.
Entre 95 y 2007, mi esposo me abusó físicamente, me aventaba cosas, me pateaba, me golpeaba. En 2 ocasiones, cuando tenía miedo de que él lo iba a volver a hacer, llamé a la policía, pero ellos cuando llegaban no encontraban señales de abuso, no hicieron nada. Mi esposo se enojaba y me dijo que cuando volviera a llamar a la policía, él iba a llamar a migración. Me dijo que si trataba de dejarlo y llevarme a mi hijo, él me iba a acusar de secuestro y yo terminaría en la cárcel.
Between 1995 and 2007, my husband physically and psychologically abused me. He would throw things at me, hit me, and kick me. On a couple of occasions, when I was afraid of what he might do, I called 911. But when the police came, they didn't see any bruises or other evidence of abuse. They left without doing anything. My husband got angry and said that if I did that again, he would report me to immigration. He said that if I tried to return to Mexico with my son, he would accuse me of kidnapping and I would go to jail.
Eventualmente, él me reportó a migración y estuve detenida por 4 meses. Tuve la suerte de encontrar un abogado que me ayudó a conseguir mi residencia bajo Bagua y eventualmente pude ganar la custodia de mis hijos. Ahora mis hijos y yo estamos más seguros, pero llevaremos las cicatrices de muchos años de abuso y miedo a la deportación.
Eventually, he did report me to immigration, and I was detained for 4 months. I was lucky to find a lawyer who helped me to apply for my residency under VAWA. When I was released, I was eventually able to get custody of my children. My children and I are safe now, but we will always be scared by those 12 years of abuse and the fear of deportation.
Cada día las mujeres indocumentadas viven con la violencia y el miedo. Las mujeres están perdiendo a sus hijos justo como yo casi los pierdo. Llegamos a este país buscando la seguridad y la protección, pero muchas veces lo que encontramos las mujeres es una pesadilla. Espero que mi historia les haya ayudado a ver la urgencia de una reforma migratoria con camino a la ciudadanía y con protecciones para las sobrevivientes de violencia. Las vidas de las mujeres están en juego y no podemos esperar más. Gracias.
Every day, undocumented immigrants live with violence and fear. Women are losing their children, just as I could have lost mine. We came to this country seeking safety and protection, but often what we find is a nightmare. I hope that my story has helped you to see the urgency of immigration reform with a roadmap to citizenship and protection for survivors of violence. Women's lives are at stake, and we cannot afford to wait any longer. Thank you so much.
Ana, aprecio mucho que tomaste el tiempo a darlos, a presentarlos una historia tuya, pero muy personal, y indicando también que es algo que desafortunadamente cada día en este país, mujeres en las circunstancias que estabas tú sufren esa tragedia. Y apreciamos mucho este tiempo que lo has dado. Thank you. Let me, before we go to the next witness, introduce a colleague, Judy Chu, chairman of the Asian Pacific Caucus, and and that caucus has one of the better templates, I think, of anyone in Congress in terms of the principles behind what comprehensive immigration reform should be, and I want to welcome you and thank you for being here. Let me now turn to Mr. Daniel Penado for his testimony. Sir, the floor is yours. You want to pull that? I think you need to push it a little bit.
Good morning, Chair and member of the Council. My name is Daniel Penado Zavala. I am 19 years old, and I'm from El Salvador. While I was in El Salvador, I was dedicated to my studies, and I was in 11th grade. My country is very dangerous, and a few years ago, it started getting worse. I saw a lot of young people my age being killed by gangs. My stepfather was murdered, but again, 8 years ago. My mother was left with 2 young children without a way to support them. 2 years ago, at the age of 17, I decided to leave El Salvador and look for a better life in the United States. I never imagined that my journey was going to be like it was, and I don't want anyone else to experience what I did. Young children and adolescents are marked for life by the journey to the U.S. We experience very difficult situations, and people who bring us here, they don't care about our lives. They only work for money, and they exploited us. I left El Salvador with a smuggler who drove me in a car through Mexico. I was in Rio Grande with a group of immigrants for 2 days. 2 days without food, without water. Half across the border, the smuggler abandoned us. We were found by the Border Patrol, and I decided to do something that I shouldn't have. I ran away from them to the river towards to Mexico. This was the worst decision I could have made. The smuggler took me back into the desert to help me cross into the U.S. so I could hopefully be with my family in Virginia. I never imagined that was going to happen to me in the desert. They took me to the house where I stayed for 2 days, locked up with more than 20 people in one room, without fresh air, without food. We ate only once a day. Later, they took us back to the desert to keep walking. We were walking for 2 days and 1 night. On the second night, the smuggler abandoned our group of 20 people in the desert. We were left alone in the desert without water or food. When we woke up, each person went their own way. I was alone. I worked for 2 hours. Then I accepted the fact that I was going to die in the desert. My only hope was that a plane or border patrol would see me. When this didn't happen, I started crying. And I then prayed. I thought about my family, and I asked God to find my body for my family. I thought about my 13 years old sister, and then that gave me hope. Sorry. I decided to keep walking and hope that someone would find me. After 2 days without food or water, I found a house. When I arrived at that house, I was in shock. I couldn't speak. I could only cry. Then they gave me food and water, and they helped me emotionally. I asked them to help me find Border Patrol because I wanted to go somewhere safe. The man who owned the house called the Border Patrol, and I never thought Border Patrol would be such a big help to me. They called my family and let them know I was okay. Then I was transferred to a shelter where they cared for me until I could be reunited with my family in Virginia. When I arrived to Virginia, I called many organizations to help me with my legal case. None of them could. I got new hope when someone at school gave me the business card for the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. They told me I might qualify for the special immigrant juvenile visa. The cutoff of this visa is 18, and I was 17 and 10 months when I got to Virginia. And I didn't have a job or money. I couldn't afford a lawyer. My family worked, but they couldn't pay for a lawyer for me. Unfortunately, I turned 18 before I could hire a lawyer to help me apply for the visa. It is no longer an option for me. USCRI helped me work toward a better future and find a lawyer I could afford. I pay $100 a month. 2 years have passed since these events. I'm finally with my aunt. I go to school every day. I am in my last year of SOL. It's a special class for English learning. I go to school. I am in 11th grade and a junior, and I hope to graduate high school next year. I am in my second year of junior ROTC. It's a class. I live a tranquil life without a fear, a life that is better than in my country. My sister now lives with our grandparents, but they make only $125 a month, and couldn't afford her school. After school, I had a part-time job, which has made it possible for my sister to go to school. I pay for it because my mom and my grandparents aren't able to do that. My work and school keep me busy, and I don't have time for friends. My first year of school, I was on the honor roll and got the certificate for pass all my class with an A. In this moment, I am in the regular classes and on track to graduate. My teachers tell me that I am a good example for other students due to my dedication, hard work, and desire to succeed. In the future, if I am permitted to stay in the U.S., I would like to join the military and go to college. My dream is to serve the United States by becoming a mechanic for the military. I hope that the USA Congress will find a way for people like me who need protection but may not qualify for visa to find a solution. Children are also shouldn't have to fight their case alone in court without an attorney. My other hope is that children and young people think twice before taking such a dangerous journey. It is easy, it is not easy, and they are in the hands of smugglers who don't care about their life. They only care about money. Many people are not able to survive and lost their life. The fear you won't survive, to think you will never see your family again, or to resign yourself to dying alone in the desert, is something that marks you for life. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Penado. Appreciate it. And congratulations on the work that you're doing. It's very inspiring and to some extent typical of what a lot of people want to do for themselves in this country. You're a good example. Thank you. Let me also welcome, joining us today is co-chair of Progressive Caucus, good friend and advocate, Mr. Keith Ellison. To my left, Ms. Jan Schakowsky from Illinois, Janice Hahn from California, and Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is the representative for Washington, D.C. Let me thank my colleagues for joining us. After Ms. Gomez, if members that are here have a comment or a question, I'll turn to them. But let me proceed right now with Maria Rubio Sanchez Gomez, 19-year-old student studying computer science. She's a leader in her community, participating in a variety of community activities and the community group Illinois People's Action. In 2012, Ruby's family was torn apart when her father was deported to Mexico. Ruby is a DACA recipient who is committed to working for immigration reform with the most important principle of keeping families together. With that, thank you, Maria, and the floor is yours.
My name is Ruby Sanchez. I'm 19 years old. I'm a college student, a daughter, and a sister. I'm here today because I need your help to make immigration reform a reality this year. My father moved to the United States in 2003, and my brothers, my mother, and I joined him 2 years later. We came here in an attempt to get away from all the drug cartel crime and violence that flooded our state in Mexico. We came here seeking to work hard and have a good life. My dad is a hardworking man who has always tried to provide the best for his family. He's a skilled mechanic and provided a valuable service to the community. But in July of 2012, our family was torn apart by his deportation. Our problem started in 2010 when my dad was pulled over by a sheriff's deputy and taken into custody. He was charged with immigration violations that took place in Indiana, but my dad had never been there, so they clearly had confused him with someone else. He was eventually released from the charges. Then, 2 years later, government officials in street clothes knocked on our door. They were looking for someone we didn't know, and when they asked, we let them search the house. We thought, we are not criminals, we have nothing to hide. Because they were not uniformed and it did not occur to us they were ICE officials, we didn't ask for a warrant. Later that day, my family went out for groceries. But as soon as we got to the main road, 4 government cars surrounded us. Sorry. They took my dad. They took my dad. We didn't hear from him for weeks. After being detained for a month in various detention centers. Sorry. We heard from my dad for the first time. He had been deported and sent back to Mexico with no explanations. That was the worst year of my life. After my dad was taken, our family was left with nothing. My dad was the one who provided for us. My mom stayed at home and took care of my brothers. With him gone, my family didn't have anywhere to live and even food to eat. My mother and I went hungry and sacrificed our meals to feed my younger siblings. Every day my mom would get up trying not to cry, but I would know that she had stayed up all night crying and stressing about what would happen to us. I became really worried about my mother's health. She nearly had a heart attack from the stress and sadness. To help her out, I got a job in order to bring some food, at least for my younger siblings. I worked as a waitress for several months while trying to complete my senior year of high school. It was really hard to go to a job where almost everybody knew and asked about my dad, but it was even harder knowing that after work I would have to go back to my nightmare. In March of 2013, I applied and received DACA. I know that my future is now a little bit more secure, but my family is still not safe. We're still without my dad. We could still suffer more separation at any moment. DACA is important, but it's not enough. I'm here today because my family is not the only one who has gone through this. Every day that we don't pass immigration reform, 1,100 people are being deported, which means thousands of families are suffering and being torn apart by an unjust immigration system. Thousands of communities are losing their leaders like my dad. And millions of kids are being afraid of losing their parents. No one else should have gone through what my family went through. I am hopeful because together we are strong, and we still have a chance to pass immigration reform this year. All we are asking is for a chance to a future, a chance for safety and security, and a chance to contribute to the greatness of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask my colleague, the co-chair, Mr. Ellison, if he has any questions and/or comment. Mr. Ellison.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank all of you very much. And I'd like you to know, Ruby, your testimony is incredibly moving and important. And anybody with a heart beating in their chest has to listen to what you're saying. And I just want to say to you that your activism and your presence here and your work is bearing fruit. People notice. We just have to get more people in Congress to give us a vote. And I also just want to ask you a few questions. One of the things that I have has come across my desk is that when people are in detention, that sometimes they are put in cells and in confinement with people who are in jails, who are Americans, who are waiting for trial. In my own state of Minnesota, and there's a county jail that had an 18-year-old fellow who was there on an ICE detention hold, who was put in a cell with a person who had been convicted of sex offenses and was awaiting trial on another one, and he was molested by this guy. So my question is this something that any of you are seeing? I mean, what happens once folks like your dad ends up in detention and is waiting for whatever to happen is going to happen? Is that a problem that we need to focus on too?
Well, yeah, my dad, he was in a cell as a punishment, but all by himself. And he said that he suffers so many punishment in jail just because I'm not sure what the immigration charges were from Indiana. So he said he had several punishment he was put into. Once he told me that he was handcuffed all the way from his neck all the way down to his feet, and he was put in a big gym. And it was around 12 when they woke him up and took him to the gym, and they turned the AC on as a punishment for he didn't know why it was happening, and he had to stay there till like 6 in the morning until they came to get him. And he said it was super cold and that he thought he was gonna die there because of the punishment.
Thank you. Let me ask Ms. Schakowsky if she has any questions or comments.
First of all, I really want to thank you all for being here and for the testimony. Adriana, I'm so sorry I missed yours because I did want to ask you about your ability to seek help under the Violence Against Women Act, which I was actually able to get amendments that allowed, regardless of status, the wives of abusers or the partners of abusers to get help and relief under VAWA. But first, let me just say, I'm really proud of you for coming forward and telling your difficult stories, because we can have discussions about immigration here, and people like the Majority Whip Eric Cantor can send out mailings and say, I'm not for amnesty. He just did one of those. And I just wonder if he has heard from families that have been separated and ask the question, how does this serve the interest of the United States of America? Why is it helpful to this country in any way that your father was deported? I mean, what value does this express about our country? It's just, it's silly. It's wrong and counterproductive, I think. But Adriana, I just wanted to ask you if you were able to access services and legal assistance and all that. Maybe you said that in your testimony, but I wasn't here, so if you could explain.
Pues fue por la ayuda de diferentes organizaciones y por los testimonios de otras personas que estuvieron detenidas en el centro de detención, y también por la falta de información de otras personas fue lo que me ayudó a buscar más ayuda.
I was able to seek assistance through various nonprofit organizations. I was also able to obtain assistance of some of the other women who were detained along with me and through their testimonies.
Was she able to get a U visa or some kind of visa?
She was able to get relief under VAWA.
Okay. I think this is really important for people to understand that the law now is, it used to be that the immigrant woman who was dependent on the abuser for her status and therefore was afraid ever to complain, now there is relief under the Violence Against Women Act. So people should just know that if you encounter a situation like it. Thank you.
And a great deal of thanks goes to Jan and other women leaders in our Congress for making sure that happened during that process. Let me turn now to Ms. Judy Chu for any comments or questions at this point.
Well, I want to thank you for your very moving testimony, and I appreciate it because you have truly put the face on what is going on with our broken immigration system. And you demonstrate to us that women and children are the backbones of our communities, and that keeping families together should be a cornerstone of our immigration policy, because families support one another, they help one another, and they are the ones that help each other to survive. So to break up the family in this way, in the ways that you have talked about, is just horrendous and counterproductive in terms of making sure that people can be as successful as they can be. And Adriana, you talked about being a domestic violence survivor, and you talked about calling 911 finally after many, many years of abuse, and you said that between 1995 and 2007 that your husband physically and psychologically abused you and threw things at you and hit you and kicked you. But you summoned up the courage to call 911. And how did you get the courage to do that, and why did you hesitate before that?
Tuve el valor por parar esta violencia por mis hijos, porque no
Yep.
quería que ellos siguieran viendo este abuso, porque ellos también sufrieron el abuso.
I got the courage to call 911 mostly because of my children, because they also suffered a lot of this abuse, and it was mostly because of them.
Well, thank you for that courage.
Let me also welcome colleague Representative Horsford. Thank you very much for being here. Let me ask Ms. Hahn if she has any questions or comments.
Thank you. I too want to thank all of you for having the courage in your lives before you came here, but certainly your courage in coming here today and telling your story. It's true, I associate my remarks with Jan Schakowsky on how counterproductive our policies are right now to really to the interest of the United States. And it makes me so angry to hear some of our friends on the other side talk about family values when everything that you're sharing today is really so against family values. And every family matters. Every family, no matter what color, what shape, what size, what background, where you came from, every family should matter, and it does to many of us. And Ruby, I was going to ask a question. You pretty much answered it. I was going to say, how has DACA, because we've, in my office in Los Angeles, I represent Los Angeles County, part of it, and we have about 1 million undocumented folks in Los Angeles County. My district particularly is certainly affected by our broken immigration system. Our office works very hard to help young people, and we've been successful in helping those who can apply under DACA. But is that good enough? Is the deferred action that our president initiated, is that good enough? Or what else in your life would be improved, obviously, if we pass comprehensive immigration reform?
Well, I have three brothers. One of them is a U.S. citizen, and he's 3. And I have another one who's 10. He's not able to get DACA because he's not 15 yet. And so he doesn't. So right now it's just like we're still suffering because at any moment immigration could stop by our house and take my mom. And then just immigration reform, it's urgent. We really need it. And but DACA, it's important. It helps me, but it's not enough. So.
Right, thank you. Yeah, the constant fear and anxiety that you live under is a stress that I think few of us can even imagine. It's pretty impressive that you're able to function, to go to school, to have a job, and to take care of your siblings like you do and support your mom in your situation. I really applaud your courage. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you. Ms. Holmes Norton, any comments or questions?
I want to thank you for stepping forward. I think part of the difficulty we're having here is the way the Congress has been gerrymandered. Our immigrant population is spread all over the United States, but the way in which our Republican colleagues live is in areas where they come into contact because of gerrymandering only with people like themselves. If they could hear what we heard this morning, if they could hear the voices, it seems to me we would have to get further than we have gotten. If they could hear Adriana and what the immigration, the new law will mean for women in her situation facing domestic violence. If they could hear Daniel, the District of Columbia and this region is the home of many immigrants from El Salvador. If they could hear Maria and the breakup of this intact family with the breadwinner taken away, I still don't know how the family was able to survive. Then it seems to me that it would be impossible to sit as they are now and do nothing. That's why I think this forum this morning is of such importance. Daniel, I was very concerned about children alone, or in the case of some, separated from their families as they happen to be coming. The only thing more traumatizing than I think what Maria experienced would be to be a child alone in this circumstance. I can't even imagine it. I understand that you were taken by the Border Control to a shelter. I would be most interested in knowing how children are treated in those shelters, children without their parents. They happen to have found your aunt. I was very fortunate that you had a relative in this country. But how are children treated? What happens to children in these shelters?
In the shelter, they gave us medical supplies, anything we need. They treat us good. For instance, we can forget everything about what happened to us and the robbed and everything. So they do their best to find the solution in our cases.
Is there any education in these shelters?
No. The only thing you have to do is clean your room. That's it.
Well, what Daniel is saying is that there's humane treatment of these children. They understand they are children. What happens, though, to a child when they can't find an aunt or they can't find?
They go into the judge and they approve the deportation. It's not deportation, it's voluntary. They go back to their countries.
My. Well, and then I'm not sure what that means.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Adriana.
Let me now ask our colleague, Mr. Hartsford, if he has any comments or questions, sir.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Mr. Grijalva and Mr. Ellison and the Progressive Caucus co-chairs for conducting this important forum. I represent Nevada's 4th Congressional District, which includes North Las Vegas and Las Vegas and the central rural part of Nevada. And like today, I have conducted numerous public forums on immigration, on the problems with deportation and detention, and at every meeting that we've had courageous people like our panelist here today who have come forward to share their story in an effort to explain how broken the immigration system is. And one of the stories that impacts me the most is one of Thelma and her son, Brian. Thelma came to the United States when she was just 25 years old, looking for a better way for her family. and her son, Brian, who's a U.S. citizen, and is about to graduate from college, almost didn't get to see his mother, or his mother didn't almost get to see him graduate. Thelma was picked up by ICE after her estranged husband, who abused her, called ICE on her and had her picked up. And for 4 weeks, she remained in detention until Congressman Gutierrez and Hinojosa were in my district doing a forum. They heard Brian come up and share the story about his mother. So we were able to intervene because, as Ms. Chakowski explained, under the Violence Against Women Act, women who are undocumented are now protected under the U visa and asylum, but that was not afforded to Thelma in her case. So I promised Thelma that I would continue to share her story and that of her son. I just got an email this morning telling me that ICE may still try to deport Thelma because they're claiming that she can't substantiate the years of abuse that she was under. So now she's being abused again, but this time by a broken immigration system. And, you know, for me, like my colleagues here, the hypocrisy of my colleagues on the other side. If I hear them talk about family values one more day and not respect the families that are represented here today, or the families that each one of us represents in our district, it's so hypocritical to me. Because immigration should be about keeping our families together, whether it's Thelma or Brian or any one of you. And so I appreciate your courage in coming here today, and I pledge to do all that I can to get to a solution, because deferred action is good, but it's not enough. Having legalization will help, but it's not a pathway to citizenship. And while we want the president to act and to review the deportation, that is not a permanent legislative fix to what's broken in our immigration policy. Only Congress can change that, and there's only one person in the House of Representatives who is standing in our way, and that's Speaker John Boehner. We have the votes, but he won't give us a vote. And that's why my colleagues and I will continue to do everything in our power to push for a vote, because we know ultimately that's the only solution that will help our families. So thank you for your courage, for speaking up today. You represent millions of families. It's not just you. Each one of you represents so many others who are out there who need this voice to be heard. So thank you very much for your courage.
Let me thank the panel and appreciate very much that you're here. Your testimony is very powerful. And as Mr. Horford said, these are stories that are repeated across the station. And I use the word cynical about not dealing with this issue. It is indeed cynical. It borders on cruelty, and it undercuts everything that this country is supposed to be about. As a nation, we should be embarrassed. As a Congress, we should be ashamed. And as you, as individuals that have had to go through this toll, I want to thank you for your courage today. I appreciate very much your testimony, and I'm asked the next panel to come up, and thank you very, very much.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, let me set the panel down, and then we'll turn to you. And as the other panel is getting seated, let me turn to our colleague from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee, for any comments she might have, and then we'll begin receiving the testimony of the individuals that are next. Ms. Jackson, the floor is yours.
I am, Mr. Chairman. I was just waiting for your witnesses to be seated.
Thank you.
I didn't realize there were two panels. Let me first of all acknowledge these powerful stories. That have been offered this morning, and I want to thank our co-chairs and Chairman Grijalva for holding this passionate hearing. In Houston, we are going to have a session on the impact of deportation on so many, and every day immigration issues become wrapped up in sex trafficking and human trafficking because people are abused or taken advantage of or held against their will. And the more we have a broken system, the more we find that people are devastated, torn from their families, children left behind, children wondering whether mom or dad will return. And so I am hopeful that we will continue to go to our districts and reinvest in the community by educating the community. Acquiescence and silence is deadly. And the more we are silent on the issue of immigration reform because we feel that we've said it over and over again, there is a great potential for the continued devastation. The most painful part of the stories that we heard, but in my district, the separation of families is enormous. And children are innocent. And we've heard stories of children going to school and wondering whether mom or dad will be there. Or in the best times of an elementary school child, for a parent to come forward to a school and listen to how well they're doing, parent-teacher conference, parents can't come because they're afraid of any governmental entity, and that governmental entity represents to them a potential threat of deportation. Today I'm going to offer on the floor of the House an amendment that deals with the T and U visa to try and get more education on protecting women who report domestic violence, who are undocumented, to have law enforcement know that they should not be captured or put in jail, held for deportation when they are bringing to the attention of law enforcement authorities that they have been continuously abused. We have these visas, and in the midst of a system that is broken, it is important that we use these visas for these women who are broken. So, Mr. Chairman, I will be listening for a moment. In a few minutes, I will leave for the Judiciary Committee, where we will have the Secretary of Homeland Security, and I hope that everyone imagines what I will be talking about. So I have my documents, this wonderful packet. I'll have a lot of ammunition. And to the Capitol Police, don't drag us out. I don't have real ammunition, but I have the right ammunition to be able to talk about where we are and the pain of where we are. Let me thank all the previous witnesses and the witnesses here. Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I do believe that one day we shall overcome.
Thank you very much. Let me thank the panelists, but in doing so, let me also, I think we have special thanks to First Focus, and in particular Wendy Cervantes. The report on the cost of inaction, why children can't wait for immigration reform, is a very, very good document, and something that prompted us to begin to have these kinds of hearings and also have hearings in our own district on the impact of women and children in this stalled immigration process that we have here. We Belong Together, Fast for Families, United We Dream, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, and of course our 7 witnesses, including distinguished panel that we have before us today. Let me begin with Megan McKenna as Communications and Advocacy Director for Kids in Need of Defense. Your testimony, the floor is yours. Thank you so much, and thank you for the help in putting this together.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this panel today. I'm going to talk about unaccompanied children. The United States is facing a child migration emergency. Unprecedented numbers of unaccompanied children have been coming to the U.S. in recent years, a more than tenfold increase since 2011. The large majority are from Central America, primarily Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Up to 2011, an average of 6,000 to 8,000 children came alone to the United States each year. In 2012, that number jumped to nearly 14,000. In 2013, it nearly doubled again. The government has projected that 60,000 would come by the end of fiscal year 2014, but we have already surpassed that number and could reach 70,000 or more by the end of September. The government is projecting over 100,000 children could come next year. One weekend in May, for example, 1,000 children crossed alone into the United States. The children are coming at younger and younger ages, and the ratio of boys to girls has increased significantly to 60% boys, 40% girls. Many of the girls are victims of sexual violence. A recent report by the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, on unaccompanied children from Central America and Mexico found that the primary reason for these children's flight is increasing violence in Central America, driven by drug cartels and a variety of other criminal elements, and that the majority of these children are fleeing violence that their home countries are unable to protect them from, and that may render them eligible for international protection. The children referred to KIND confirm this analysis. Most describe fleeing forced gang recruitment and violence for refusing to join with criminal groups, as well as threats and harm to family members. The U.S. system that governs the custody, care, release, and social and legal services for these children has for many years been a work in progress, and the pressures created by such large numbers of children is underscoring its weaknesses. The system needs to be entirely reworked in order to embrace child protection at its core, while at the same time helping ensure that children do not have to make the dangerous journey to the United States in the first place. Clearly, a new paradigm for the treatment of these children must be developed. Any changes must be governed by the principle of the best interest of the child and adherence to international and domestic standards of refugee protection and child protection. After Customs and Border Patrol transfers the custody of the children they apprehend at the border to the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee Resettlement, it is charged with finding and screening appropriate sponsors to whom the child can be released while their immigration cases are being adjudicated. ORR is now releasing 90% of these children in less than 1 month on average and trying to reduce the children's time in custody even further. While institutionalizing children for prolonged periods is undesirable, we are concerned about the quality of screening of sponsors, which could result in children being released to unsafe or unstable environments. Moreover, these quick releases are jeopardizing the ability of legal service providers such as KIND to deliver critical services to children while they are in custody, including Know Your Rights presentations to help them understand the immigration process they are in and their rights and responsibilities within it, and screening to determine eligibility for legal relief and to identify particularly vulnerable children. To compound the protection concerns, post-release services for these children are severely under-resourced and provided on an ad hoc basis as a result. This means tens of thousands of these children are being released in desperate need of psychosocial services and receiving little, if any, care, and with little to no access to legal representation in their immigration proceedings. Without an attorney, these children are unable to fully present their case to a U.S. immigration judge, even though they carry the burden to prove that they should not be deported to their home countries. KIND has witnessed children as young as 5 years old appear before an immigration judge as a DHS trial attorney argues for their deportation, and the child has no attorney by her side. As a result, the children can be repatriated to the violent conditions that they have fled in the first place, thus putting their well-being and even their lives in danger. This leads to another significant gap in the U.S.'s treatment of these children, a lack of return and reintegration assistance, particularly vital as the U.S. does not use the best interest standards when determining if a child is to be deported. KIND has implemented a pilot project in Guatemala that has demonstrated that with only a modest amount of assistance, many children can be reunited with family and begin their lives over again in their community. which includes help with school enrollment, scholarships, jobs, skills training, healthcare, and other basic needs. As a top destination country, we must ensure the safe return and reintegration of unaccompanied children into their home country so that we do not return these children to harm. The Department of State and USAID should proactively support such programming. It is what is right for these children, and it could help mitigate the flow of children to the United States. In closing, KIND offers the following guiding principles as the U.S. grapples with this difficult crisis. First, the best interest of the child must be the primary consideration in all decisions relating to these children at every level of government. This would provide a basic level of protection that would lead to real change and more positive outcomes for these children. The children must be released from U.S. government custody to well-screened sponsors as soon as possible, but they must be released with access to wraparound comprehensive services that would address their social service and legal needs. This is currently the largest and most disturbing gap in our current system that puts tens of thousands of these children at risk for a variety of protection concerns. Children must be appointed counsel to represent them through their deportation proceedings. Attorneys could be government-appointed or private sector pro bono attorneys who volunteer their time and resources, which is cost-effective and has proven successful. Any changes to the U.S. system are largely meaningless if these children do not have access to legal representation. The U.S. should establish robust return and reintegration programs that will help children returning alone stay safely and sustainably in their home countries. KIND's pilot project in Guatemala could be seen as a model. Very helpful provisions on return and reintegration are included in H.R. 15, as well as the Child Trafficking Victims Protection Act, H.R. 2624. The U.S. should address the root causes of this unprecedented migration in its development assistance to top sending countries through USAID or other agencies within the State Department. Programs such as the Central American Regional Security Initiative, or CARSI, in the State Department could be used towards this goal. USAID could also tailor its youth programming in the top sending countries to address the needs of these children and help prevent their need to migrate. Finally, the U.S. should view the issue of child migrants not as just as a U.S. immigration issue, but also one that is linked to our foreign policy in the region. This should include encouraging regional collaboration among countries of origin, transit, and destination to provide children with true opportunities to remain home safely, and when they do migrate, to ensure their safety and well-being. We remain optimistic that this historic migration of unaccompanied children to the United States will in the end result in a U.S. system with enhanced child protection mechanisms and one in which children are treated as they need and deserve to be treated, as children first and foremost. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and let me welcome Ms. Yvette Clark, from Congresswoman from New York. Thank you for joining us. She's chair of the Task Force on Immigration for the Congressional Black Caucus and has been a leader in assuring that the application of immigration reform is extended to all immigrants communities in this country, and I am very appreciative of her being here today. Thank you. Let me ask our next witness, Brene, is that right? Ms. Brene is the Director of Migrant Rights in the Justice Program at the Women's Refugee Commission, and she's foremost expert on U.S. immigration, detention, and reform, and brings with her a vast background in labor and in human rights organizations and as a human rights officer with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and in Bosnia, head of the Serbia field office. She's testified before Congress on other occasions. We are happy to have her expertise and her comments with us today. Ms. Brene.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to testify on this matter. For nearly 2 decades, the Women's Refugee Commission has visited immigration detention facilities, spoken to staff, detainees, service providers, and communities about detention policies and practices. There's no question that our failing immigration system has resulted in the unnecessary detention of thousands of immigrants every day at great cost to American taxpayers and to the community. Families, women, and children are particularly adversely affected by an immigration enforcement and detention system that does not take their needs into account. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, operates the largest detention program in the country, detaining over 450,000 individuals a year with an average daily population of over 33,000. Approximately 10% of immigration detainees are women. Detention is problematic for everyone, but women in detention face some additional hurdles. After receiving desperate phone calls from immigrant women detained at the Baker County Jail, attorneys from Americans for Immigrant Justice decided to visit. But when the team arrived, the warden insisted the jail held no women. Finally, after all their protests were rebuffed, they left. The next day, they received another call from a woman, again, at Baker County Jail, desperate for help. The women had been there all along, but somehow the warden was unaware of their existence. This example is symptomatic of women's invisibility in detention. Women in detention experience sexual assault, insufficient medical care, lack of access to telephones, limited access to legal services, limited recreation and visitation, and restricted access to family courts that has led, in some cases, to the permanent loss of their parental rights. Because there are fewer large facilities that accept women, they're more likely to be transferred far away from their families when detained. In 2013, women's average length of stay in detention was 18% longer than that of men. Women are half as likely than men in immigration detention to have violent criminal records, yet they are more likely to be commingled with criminal detainees, criminals serving sentences. Women in detention are 5 times more likely than men to be asylum seekers. In addition to the deficiencies in medical care faced by everyone in immigration detention, women have particular health needs that are often not met or exacerbated by their detention. Some of the most disturbing accounts come from pregnant women. While ICE policy does not allow the shackling of women during delivery, women are routinely shackled during their pregnancy and during postpartum recovery. Miscarriages are not uncommon. Sexual assaults in custody occur during intake, during detention, during transport, and even during the removal process. A 2012 FOIA request by the ACLU revealed nearly 200 allegations of sexual assault since 2007. The separation of families that results from detention takes a particular toll on women. While we heard this morning of the effect of a father being detained and the effect on that family's income, women are more likely to be single parents, meaning that their detention results in no one being left to care for children left at home. In one case, I had a woman beg me to help her make arrangements to take her child back to Ecuador when she was deported. She had left her 1-year-old son with a neighbor when she was detained and was unable to contact the neighbor for days. Even after being able to make contact, she had no other viable alternative for the care of her child. Eventually, she was deported without him. The last piece of information she heard from her son was that his father, who had been abusive, had picked him up from the neighbor. Mothers who are separated from their children in this way are traumatized, as are their children. They worry not only about their children's physical safety, but also about the psychological toll this takes on them. ICE policies now do provide some protections, but within the context of our current immigration laws, they do not address the underlying issue that thousands of families are living in precarious circumstances and at risk of permanent separation. Unaccompanied children in immigration custody are transferred, as you heard just a moment ago, to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. The majority are held in shelters or foster care and are released to family or sponsors within a short time. However, concerns remain even for the children who are not released. Despite being in civil custody, the children are restricted in their movement and contact with the outside world, while sometimes being held in facilities intended for rehabilitation and punishment. Despite years of pressure from advocates or authorities to introduce improved measures of oversight and protection in these facilities, ORR has yet to implement the Prison Rape Elimination Act regulations. A recent FOIA by the Houston Chronicle revealed 101 significant incident reports involving abuse allegations against staff members in a 2-year period. These allegations include unwanted touching, kissing, physical abuse such as kicking, beating, and hitting, and rape. Of further concern are the conditions in which children are held in the custody of Customs and Border Protection. CBP facilities were not designed to accommodate the needs of children. They are concrete cells with no windows, no beds, no blankets, no separate toilet facilities, no showers, no soap, no toothbrush or toothpaste, no changes of clothes. Temperatures are kept extremely low to the extent that they're commonly referred to by children and CBP agents alike as freezers or hieleras. Cells are often so crowded that the detainees have no space to lie down. Children are left to sleep on the cold concrete floor with bright overhead lights left on throughout the night. Detention should be used as a last resort, but in the context of our broken immigration system, DHS continues to detain far more individuals than necessary at great financial expense and with damaging consequences to our communities and to individual human dignity. The inability to obtain legal status makes detention an all too real possibility for hundreds of thousands of women and children who present no danger to society. There's no question that administrative action is not enough to address this crisis. We need legislation and policies that allow people to obtain legal status and a path to citizenship and keep their families together. We need legislation that protects families and take into account their rights, the rights of women and the rights of children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me now ask Dr. Yoshikawa, a professor at New York University, received his PhD from NYU, has a distinguished academic career, a career of involvement in a variety of high-level endeavors, both with institutions of higher learning, with the Clinton and Obama administrations, and in 2013 he was elected to the National Academy of Education. He currently serves as the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Integration of Immigrants into the American Society and the Forum on Investing in Young Children Globally. With that, let me turn the floor to Dr. Yoshikawa. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Representative Grijalva and Representatives Ellison, Horsford, Clark, and Hahn. It's an honor for me to be here and talk about the broad population of unauthorized immigrant parents and what the effect of having an unauthorized parent is on children's development. So the source for this review is a recent report in the social policy reports of the Society for Research and Child Development on this topic, where I reviewed the existing research evidence from the social sciences on the effects of unauthorized status, essentially mixed status families, on children's development across the lifespan. And so this draws in part on a study I did of hundreds of families where we followed children from birth to age 6, but also the research of social scientists across the country who have started to look at this issue. So we know that of the 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States, many of them are parents. And I still think many of the public aren't aware of this. We might see the unauthorized as victims, as laborers, as lawbreakers, but we don't see them as parents. And in fact, over 5.5 million children have at least one unauthorized parent. That is close to 1 out of 3 children with an immigrant parent in the United States. Close to 1 out of 3 children in an immigrant family. So this is a large proportion of children. It represents on average a little over 1 child in every public school classroom in the United States. And in areas with high immigrant concentration, that is obviously much higher. Of those 5.5 million children, roughly 80% are U.S. citizens, and then the remaining just over 1 million are unauthorized themselves. So the question in our review was to understand how are these children and parents faring? How are they doing at a period in time in U.S. society when without immigration our society would be shrinking? So these truly are key to the future productivity of our nation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how parent unauthorized status impacts both parents, mothers and fathers, as well as their children's development, and then talk a little bit about the policy implications. So as you might imagine, having a parent who's unauthorized is not good for your development. It represents a risk above and beyond the issues of low levels of education or socioeconomic status that often low-income immigrant parents share in the United States. My own research shows that by even the age of 2, children of the unauthorized relative to children of the authorized show lower levels of cognitive development, things like expressive or receptive vocabulary. By middle childhood, we have studies showing that children are showing lower levels of positive development. By adolescence, symptoms of anxiety and depression. As children understand what it means to have an unauthorized parent, it means that the anxiety, the worry about whether my mom or dad will be taken away from the family and deported start arising. So we start seeing effects on things like anxiety and depression. By young adulthood, a large-scale study in California showed that having an unauthorized parent relative to an authorized parent in the same ethnic group, Mexican origin families, resulted in 1.25 to 1.5 fewer years of schooling, which is a huge educational barrier. And that is for citizen children, right? Without the well-known barriers to education and employment opportunities that unauthorized youth face. And there, of course, researchers such as Roberto Gonzalez have done a wonderful job documenting what it learns to awaken to your own status of being illegal, quote unquote illegal, in American society. Then I think much of the powerful witness testimony earlier focused on the impact of deportations and removal proceedings on children. And there we see a wide swath of effects, including the drastic loss in income that was mentioned, the loss of parents, in some case all caregivers in the family, the impacts on school attendance, the typical kinds of social isolation that are brought about with fear of going to school, and effects on mental health and behavior problems of children. Now, what are the mechanisms of those effects on children? It's not a surprise that there are consistent effects on parents, which include greater economic hardship and psychological distress of being unauthorized. The labor force exploitation of these workers is quite extreme. So in 2 large-scale studies, in my own study in New York and study by Bernhardt, Milkman, and other colleagues in 3 cities across the country, the rates of illegally low wages, wages below the legal minimum, were between 30 and 40% for unauthorized workers, and in my study, 38% for unauthorized mothers, 32% for unauthorized fathers. Typically, the work week for these parents is 6 days of work a week, 12 hours a day, not including commuting. And so we had stories like the father who had delivered groceries from a deli for the last 10 years, had injured both of his knees in wintertime slips on the New York City streets, was afraid to ask for a raise for those entire 10 years, and so was working below $10 an hour after 10 years, was ashamed to tell his growing son that he was still, quote unquote, a delivery boy. So we know that those kinds of economic conditions also place stress on families and harm children's academic achievement and increase rates of behavior problems and mental health problems for children. So among the policies that might make a difference, obviously the most fundamental one is a pathway to citizenship. DACA, as some have mentioned, focuses on the young and college-ready. It in fact excludes many parents in New York City. Among the many hundreds of thousands who have not applied to DACA, over 1/3 are parents of young children. This is a group that doesn't know, for example, that they're eligible. But there are many other limitations to the focused target population of DACA. And in fact, Roberto Gonzalez's recent work shows that even though a large percentage of DACA recipients have gained new jobs, the majority of them are worrying about family members, just like we heard earlier on the panel. They are worrying because they have undocumented members of their families, as well as their own future, since this is, after all, a temporary reprieve. Policies that improve workplace conditions should combine worker legalization with verification rather than verification alone, and attempt to reduce the key risks of wage violations and wage stagnation, which have such harmful effects on children's development. I think we've had strong discussion of policies that might modify enforcement practices, that might actually realize the issues of prosecutorial discretion and consideration of parents with U.S. citizen children, parents in general under family and community ties provisions which are not being implemented, and the reduction of unnecessary detainment and associated parent-child separation. Finally, policies that provide opportunities early in life for learning, such as universal access to early education. So there's a link here between universal preschool and the fact that as a school system, this is an institution that unauthorized parents trust. That they would place their children, and low-income Latino families, for example, show some of the lowest rates of enrollment in preschool education, the form of investment in children's learning that has the highest rates of return to investment for U.S. society. So in closing, a full pathway to citizenship that provides access to anti-poverty supports like the EITC, application to all unauthorized, including older parents and those not participating in education or least college-ready, worker legalization combined with employee verification, and reducing barriers to enrolling citizen children in supports that aim their development would go a long way towards bringing these children out of the shadows and easing the harm that is being caused at the moment to their development across their lifespans. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me now ask Andrea Cristina Mercado, Campaign Director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance and co-anchor of We Belong Together, has been at the forefront, Domestic Workers Alliance, of not only promoting immigration reform, but promoting the idea that it has to be fair and just. And we appreciate your presence, and floor is yours.
Thank you, Congressman Grijalva. Thank you, Representative Ellison, Representative Horsford, Representative Clark, and Representative Hahn for the opportunity to be here today. I'm here representing the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and together with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, we co-anchor We Belong Together, Women for Common Sense Immigration Reform. We're faced with a tremendous opportunity, the opportunity to address the devastation caused by our broken immigration system, and the chance to create fair and common sense solutions. But to do so, we must acknowledge the ways that the system fails women and children, and in doing so fails us all. We must work towards immigration reform that addresses women's needs and honors women's contribution. Women and children are 3/4 of all immigrants to this country. Today and every day, 1,100 people are deported, many of them parents. I wanted to share one more story of a young man that I know, an 11-year-old Charlie, who one day went fishing with his father and his brother, and his father was detained and ended up in deportation proceedings. And when Charlie tells this story, he articulates the worst fears of millions of children. Him and his brother have trouble concentrating at school. They miss their dad. Their mom is now a single mother for the first time in the workforce, struggling to provide for her family and raise her sons alone. The stress and suffering felt by this family is not unique. It's echoed in millions of homes across the country. And there's much that can be done to end the suffering. The president must take action to alleviate the suffering, and Congress must pass immigration reform with an accessible pathway to citizenship, ensure due process, protect parental rights, allow judges the discretion to prevent deportation of parents, and allow for Ruby's dad and Charlie's dad and all of the other deported parents to return home. Deportations are not the only element of our immigration system that's separating families. Currently, we have 4 million people trapped in the family visa backlog, waiting years and sometimes decades to be reunited with their families. The family visa system is the mechanism through which most women are able to immigrate legally into this country, and it's barely functional. Naturalized U.S. citizen, 76-year-old Manuk, estimates that she'll be over 90 years old by the time her daughter is finally granted a visa and allowed to come to this country. Manuk has spent her life caring for others in this country as a home care worker, and now fears there'll be no one to care for her. Immigration reform must honor the importance of our family-based immigration system, eliminate the family visa backlog, and preserve all family immigration categories, including siblings and adult children. According to the CDC, 1 in 3 women in the United States experiences domestic violence at some point in their lives. Immigrant women are particularly vulnerable and are forced to stay in dangerous situations because of their isolation, financial dependence on their abusers, and the threat of deportation. As we heard earlier from Adriana, that fear becomes a nightmare when women who finally call law enforcement for help are themselves arrested and put into deportation proceedings, a practice that occurs far too often. Immigration reform must expand protections for asylum seekers and survivors of trafficking, increase the number of U visas provided for domestic violence victims, and ensure full access to health care and services for immigrant survivors of violence and trafficking. And immigrant women are not only more vulnerable to violence at home, but also experience high rates of abuse and exploitation on the job. In countless workplaces across the country, and particularly in industries with high concentrations of women, such as domestic work and farm work. Women workers are told they must endure unsafe working conditions, violence, sexual harassment, wage theft, or they'll be reported to immigration. The hope of immigration reform provides us an opportunity to bring all workers out of the shadows. Provisions of the POWER Act can protect immigrant workers from retaliation by unscrupulous employers, and the expansion of U visas to protect survivors of workplace abuse can ensure better protections for all. Currently, only 1 out of every 4 employment visas is issued to women. Despite the critical role that immigrant women play in our economy, it's anticipated that the demand for care workers will increase 48% in the next decade. And yet our current system does not recognize this reality. Immigration reform must include future flows in professions populated by women, allow dependent visa holders to work with full protections and adjustment to permanent status, and expand protections for immigrant women in asserting labor and civil rights. In closing, the opportunity before us is enormous. It's an opportunity to create a roadmap to citizenship for 11 million people, an opportunity to ensure that civil and human rights are upheld, an opportunity also for America to live up to its values of family and fairness. In order to truly address the failings of our current immigration system, we must view it through the eyes of women and families. And if we're to create real and lasting solutions, we must use this opportunity to ensure women's rights and equality. The time is now, and our country deserves no less. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me, for questions or comments, and let me welcome Congresswoman Gwen Moore. Appreciate you being here. Let me turn to Representative Yvette Clark for any comments or questions she might have. Then Ms. Moore, and then the rest of us that have been here also have an opportunity as well. The clock is ticking on us. The Mad Hatters will come in here and kick us all out in about 10 to 15 minutes. And so let me turn to Ms. Clark.
Let me first of all thank the co-chairs of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Mr. Raul Grijalva and Mr. Keith Ellison, as well as all the colleagues here present for seeing fit to host this hearing today. Let me thank those who gave their testimonies as well as our panelists. And I want to start by saying how demoralizing it is to be in the 21st century in the United States of America and see that we're still a nation that is not recognizing the humanity of people who've migrated to our country, who've immigrated to our country, and that these challenges of brutality and really barbaric treatment is part of the fabric of who we are at this stage of our development as a nation, and how disappointing it is that we have not seen fit as a legislative body to do the right thing. And we all know what the right thing is. You know, as I listened to the testimony and as I've read more and more about the advocacy community, it appears as though we're somewhat in a quandary. And I say that because I think everyone recognizes the inhumanity, the grinding up of humanity that has been caught in the broken system. But we're at a point where we recognize that deportations have wreaked havoc in our communities, that families are really suffering, and many of whom are, as we've said, mixed status home households. But the debate is over whether the President Obama could do more administratively to ease the pain and the pressure that exists, or whether you know, we need to apply the appropriate pressure to the legislators that have really not lived up to their obligation to our nation. There's those who believe that at this stage, the pressure needs to be on the Congress to get this done. There are others who believe that the Obama administration could be doing more to relieve the pressure. I'd like to hear from you, you know, what you feel is the best approach. I would imagine we'll probably get some mixed responses, but I'd like to hear, because I think that it's important that our nation know that leading minds have been giving a lot of thought to this. And if the president could do something administratively that would really relieve the pressure, what would you envision that being?
Wow, you're really going to cause
Excellent.
some controversy today. I'm going to be really quick because I know we don't have much time. I would just say that I think the responsibility lies with all of us, everyone. And to say one or the other, I think, is not productive. There's no question, and I think we've all spoken today about the desperate need for legislation on this issue. So I will say that any administrative action alone is not enough, and I think legislative action has to be first and foremost. But of course, there's always things that can be done in the implementation and enforcement of our laws to make them more humane. So,
Anyone else?
Okay, mum's the word. I want to just close by saying this. You know, we will reflect on this time in America where there was this this inability to come together as a nation to do right by humanity. And I hope that as we come out of this period, because I do believe comprehensive immigration reform is inevitable, that we will be able to repair the brokenness within our civil society as a result of not doing the right thing at the right time. There's so many families from around the world, quite frankly, that have been here undocumented and are really facing immeasurable hardship. When you think about the detainees and the type of harm that has visited them, the type of profiteering that has occurred as a result of this broken system, we will all have to reflect on this. And it's my hope as we come out of this with legislation and law that we never, ever see our nation return to a period where we are not recognizing ourselves in the people that we would detain and the families that we would break up. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And before I turn to Ms. Moore, the backdrop to this hearing, I said Johnson is in front of the Oversight Committee. Catholic bishops are having a mass and coming to talk to members of Congress. And then you have that singular example of fear-mongering and victimization strategies, Representative Steve King, who will be introducing, well, it's going to be a roll call vote on appropriations for commerce and justice and science, asking for the appropriations to defund any activities around DACA, deferred action. And that's the backdrop. And I mentioned that not to change the discourse, but for us to realize that this hearing today is markedly different, and it should provide us some impetus to say this kind of other craziness is what's keeping us from making any rational progress on this issue. Ms. Moore, any comments, questions?
Thank you so much, Mr. Grijalva, and thank you, Mr. Ellison, both of you, for convening this important hearing. I want to thank all of the witnesses who are here today, those that I didn't have the opportunity to hear, given my my tardiness to this hearing. I can tell you that the minute I sat down, I started hearing very disturbing information from you, Andrea. So I spared myself a lot of agony by not coming on time. You know, you say I was the lead sponsor of the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. One of the things that we were not successful in doing was increasing the number of visas available for victims of domestic violence. And then when you indicated, Ms. Mercado, that only 1 out of 4 work visas were issued to men, I guess I want an update about the numbers of women, children, the sort of disparate hardship and impact that this has on women and children, with the allocation of visas. And I guess, Mr. Yoshikawa, I probably missed the answer to this question, but I find it very compelling to know what the additional burdens are on mixed families.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. The employment visas are issued to men, and then dependents that come on that visa, such as their wives, are not authorized to work. And so obviously we can see how that connects into domestic violence when you have a situation where the woman isn't authorized to work and then is required to be financially dependent on the husband. We see higher incidences of domestic violence, and it's a real problem. And then I would say, you know, I mean, I'm in agreement with Michelle and to Representative Clark's question. You know, everyone is responsible. Until we have a solution, everyone is complicit in the suffering. And so, you know, it's up to all of us to do everything we can to end the suffering, and that includes the president, who 2 million people have been deported in his administration. You know, we really need to take a hard look at what enforcement looks like, and you know, whether or not, you know, how we are ensuring that enforcement is being done in a humane way, and reflects the values and our priorities as a nation. And then, you know, we call on all of you. We know that the situation in Congress is incredibly difficult to pass this legislation, and we need for you to do everything possible to make this happen, and to pass immigration reform that is fair and just and doesn't perpetuate the conditions that our families are experiencing today.
Two important approaches possibly to communicating the costs to society of some of these issues are the fact that in the child development literature we have estimates of the effect of domestic violence on the next generation. We have estimates of the loss of a parent or the loss of half or more of a family's income on a child's future prospects, including earnings. So I think understanding and monetizing what the costs of current policies are for the future of our economy is very important, especially given, and then responding belatedly to Representative Clark's question, that the majority of the American public supports a pathway to citizenship. And so if we brought more of that knowledge and then bolstered it with the costs to society, and add some dollar figures to our arguments, I think that might strengthen the rationale.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask one quick question for Ms. Brittany. When we talked about detention and facilities, is there a marked distinction between the private prison detention center You read that article, paying people nothing for them to work, saving them $40 million a year. I think 467 million of the account for detention goes to the private prison industry. I know in Arizona they actively promoted 1070, actively fight the state on any issue because I think they're more concerned with the bottom line, which is bed space. The distinction, I think, when we talk about abuses and other kinds of things.
Yes, so without question, there is a very large involvement of the private prison industry and for-profit
Yes.
kind of mentality in our detention system. I think I would say that in our experience, I don't think in terms of conditions, there's an enormous difference necessarily. But I think where the issue lies is in the effect it has on how many people we detain. So we all know that the private prison industry has an enormous amount of power and has had an effect, I think, without question, on the fact that we have mandatory detention policies and legislation and what is now being referred to as the bed quota that requires
30,000.
the detention of 34,000 people on any given day, whether or not it is necessary. Aside from the civil rights and human rights violations that I think that implies, there is, I think, a real question about who is profiting and why. And an example I can give is that the Etowah County facility was actually slated to close by ICE. ICE planned to stop using that facility. And, I can't say personally exactly what the reasons were, but most likely many of them were related to conditions issues. It's not a private prison, it's county jail. But as soon as notice of that was received in the area, calls were made, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement received a call from the Appropriations Committee saying, we strongly recommend that you do not close this facility. So there's economic interest at all levels, not just with private industry, and it certainly is a problem.
Thank you. Mr. Ellison.
Yeah, let me again thank you, Chairman Grijalva, for this hearing. You were the driving force behind it, and I'm so honored and proud that you really did spearhead this, because it's been an awesome hearing. Thank you to everybody on the panel. You've done a fine job. Just 3 quick points, and I know everybody wants to talk, so I'll get right at it. One, what are your recommendations on how we as members of Congress can advocate when we find abuses of people who are detained? You might have heard, I got a guy, Sherburne County, Minnesota, not far from me, 18 years old, in a cell with a convicted sex offender, in jail, awaiting trial on another offense, and he's abused. So I'm going there this coming weekend. On our off week, I'm going there. And I'm hoping we are going to put pressure on people, but there are standards and rules, and they're not being enforced, apparently. I'm asking for you, how would you recommend a member of Congress can advocate for a person in a jail like that? And then 2, I think that if you look at what all of you are saying, particularly Dr. Yoshikawa and Ms. Mercado, is that, look, when what was the number? Did you say 30 to 40% of all unauthorized workers are making sub-minimum wage? Well, that's like the heart of the matter, isn't it? Right? I mean, and I think that this is, it's important for people who are American citizens who have been opposed to immigration reform to understand that an unauthorized worker, a worker with no path to citizenship, is an exploited worker, is an afraid worker, is a worker who's not going to demand to be treated with respect, who's going to be more likely to be victim of wage theft, and who's going to be more likely to be used to discipline the rest of labor. So I believe that some of the most vociferous anti-immigration reform people in the United States Congress are actually people who take money and represent the interests of people who exploit immigrant labor. They want to keep it broken. They like it broken. Right. It's fine broken with them, because any unauthorized worker who gets mouthy and says, hey, look, you're not paying me right. You said you were going to pay me this, but I only got that. Oh, all of a sudden, ICE shows up. So we got a government-sanctioned leg breaker enforcer system here for people who want to exploit labor. Now, I'd like to get you guys' reaction to that. And Domestic Workers Alliance, you guys are awesome. We work with you guys all the time, and been able to work with Pool, and you guys have come to our conference. We want to keep that relationship going. Enough for me right now with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Doctor?
I think this really gets to the core dilemma that unauthorized parents face in the United States, and this came up again and again in our study of hundreds of families in New York City, where we really got to know these families. And it's this terrible choice they face daily between speaking up for what might be right, or enrolling their children in a learning program, or applying for child care subsidies if it's a citizen child, and this fear that by providing that information, identifying their employer, that they risk their family getting ripped apart and themselves being deported. And so this terrible dilemma between helping your family, helping your children's development, being a good parent, speaking up for your rights for the benefit of your family, and this fear of deportation.
Thank you.
Very briefly, I think as a general matter on the issue of detention, the best thing to do to avoid the situation you described is to reduce the use of detention, right, across the board. So there's a lot of things generally. I mean, that's the number one thing, reduce the use of detention and a lot of the constraints that are forcing the system into what it is now. Moving towards a civil detention system wherever it is necessary, absolutely there should be no mixing of the two different systems. And in your particular instance, I would say contact the ICE field office, contact ICE headquarters. There's no longer a public advocate, unfortunately, but they still do have a hotline, and they have people who are addressing violations of standards. So I would say file complaints, make phone calls, and encourage them not to interpret the appropriations of funding for detention beds as a bed quota.
Thank you so much. And very briefly, the Not One More campaign is actually developing tools for elected officials on how they can be most helpful with the individual cases that are coming up.
Thank you.
Ms. Hunt, comment,
Thank you.
question?
And again, I'm just going to echo what everybody said. This is an amazing hearing. Thank you to our co-chairs of the Progressive Caucus. Thank you to all of you who came to testify. I wish all of our colleagues in Congress could be sitting here today listening to your stories. Many of us today are being shadowed by someone in the foster care system. I believe they're wearing the blue shawls. My shadow is Joel Urzua, who's here. And I was just going to focus on the issue about our children who have been separated from their parents. And Joel was separated from his parents for various reasons. They're in Mexico. He was found in Los Angeles and placed in the foster care system. Joel's overcome his circumstances. He graduated from Banning High School. He's in college right now. But sounds like what we're hearing is a different story for many of the children who are separated from their parents. What can we do to focus on these kids, whether they're in the foster care system or with a single parent, to stay in school? Sounds like these circumstances are so overwhelming. Many of them are having a hard time focusing on being a child, focusing on being in school. Can we do a better job focusing in our communities on after-school programs, or how do we keep these kids focused to stay in school in the midst of this amazing burden that they are shouldering, sometimes probably unbeknownst to their fellow classmates? How can we, while we're all for comprehensive immigration reform, we want to vote, we think we have the votes to pass it. I'm pleased that our president has taken another look at his deportation policies, but in the meantime, we've got a lot of kids who have lost a parent or separated from a parent, sometimes both parents. What can we do better for them to focus on their needs, particularly staying in school?
Well, I know our system, for one, our immigration system treats children like little adults. And I think the first major change is a change of thinking. We must put child protection first. I mean, these are children first and immigrants second. And I think putting them in that frame would help certainly open up some services for them. But as you point out, the services are woefully lacking, and that's something that, again, the system needs to, instead of law enforcement and detention and funding, that should shift to what happens to people, particularly children, when they are alone in their communities. And we see children all the time going before immigration court without attorneys, and the children who are able to help, who we match with attorneys, these attorneys sometimes turn into social workers because the child has no other trusted adult to help them. And they help them enroll in school sometimes, because even if they're with a family member or a guardian with good intentions, they don't know how to get back into the system. Some of these kids have never been to school in their home countries. So I guess I would say that the focus on these kids and in their communities, integration, it must be primary, and we have to sort of turn our thinking on our heads. And again, these are children first.
I think schools, but more broadly, communities have a responsibility to be responsive to the needs of low-income immigrant families. And of course, there are situations where you know these kinds of statuses versus not. But I think often there isn't adequate professional development around the needs of low-income students from immigrant families who are not doing so well in school, who might not be showing up consistently. We know we have tremendous dropout problems, more broadly speaking, among children of immigrant families in the United States, particularly coming from low-income backgrounds. So we all have to take responsibility. When I talk about this issue, I generally ask who in the audience knows somebody who's undocumented. Large majorities of people do. I think if those of us, all of us in communities, social service providers, educators, spoke up for and learned more about the needs of this population, and more broadly the low-income students in low-income immigrant families, then I think we would create more responsive school systems.
Thank you very much. And Regina is here shadowing me today. You've been sitting and shadowing from there. Hopefully we'll go do other things today. Thank you very much for being here today. Let me turn to Mr. Horsford for any comments he may have, and
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Panel.
I just want to close by saying you all make the case. I mean, we have the research, talk about the child development, cognitive development, the education needs, the impacts on children in their schooling, the impacts on women not being treated fairly in any regard, whether it's in the workplace or in their own standing as an individual. We have the research that says passing comprehensive immigration reform would help reduce the deficit $1 trillion. We have everything that we need, including people like Jorge Ramos and others who are holding all of us accountable and calling out the one person, Speaker John Boehner, who is standing in our way. I cannot underscore enough the frustration. I'm a new member here. I know freshmen are supposed to be seen from and not heard. I don't understand how one person gets to dictate whether or not the House of Representatives. I was elected by 700,000 people in Nevada who overwhelmingly support comprehensive immigration reform. And I have one person standing in my way and fixing what is so broken. And my colleagues support this. We have Republicans that are on our side, but there's one person. And so I hope we will take this information to him in his office. I wish that he would take just a piece of time out of his schedule to listen to some of the stories, to listen to your story. He refuses to meet with so many of constituents of mine that have traveled to DC to hear their story, but I wish he would take the time to listen, because maybe if he did, he would understand how important of a family value immigration reform really is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I want to thank the panelists, and the complexity of immigration reform is not, there's obvious solutions, but the complexity is, I think, what's frustrating to many. And it goes from the issue of detention, and it goes to the issue of how do we define hardship. It goes to the issue of the backlog on visas, structural issues that I think can be dealt with executively. And the legislative package is just that, a package that has to be important. Today, I wanted to make sure that all of you, and then I'll turn to Mr. Ellison. I wanted to make sure that we highlighted children and women. And as somebody said, the majority of the undocumented that we talk about, particularly grievous is children and what we're not doing for them by not doing immigration reform. So I want to thank you for highlighting that. We're going to enter all of this in the congressional record, so there's a permanency to it. And hopefully, as we go forward, central to any discussion on immigration reform is going to be family unification and how we treat our kids and women through this process. And I'm certainly going to keep that at the forefront of anything that I agree to or not agree to. With that, let me turn it to Mr. Ellison for any closing.
Thank you again. I wanted to leave you with the last word, Mr. Chairman, but all I wanted to do was recognize my shadow today, Grace, who is an awesome young lady who's with me today. How you doing, Grace? And all these young people around here in their blue, what do you call those things? Scarves. Are learning about the foster care system. And I'm sure we could probably take quite a bit of time to talk about immigration and the foster care system. I'm sure there are many overlaps there too. But again, hats off to you, hats off to the panel. We want to deepen and strengthen and create a stronger ongoing relationship with all of you as we fight for justice and liberation for all of our families here in America. Thank you very much.
And I think Keith and I can attest and commit that the Progressive Caucus and the members of that will not go quietly into the night as we go forward with this. And we look forward to your help, your support, your advice, and the expertise that you've given us today. Thank you so much. Meeting adjourned.